The last part of our discussion today will center around two concepts in physiology, and those include the concept of homeostasis and the concept of feedback. These are terms that you may or may not be familiar with, but you will become familiar with them in this course because they show up again and again as we move through the different topics of the course. Remember, these are physiological concepts, so we're going to be discussing the ways that body systems, organ systems, interact with each other functionally. Now, the first thing we need is a definition for this term homeostasis. Homeostasis is defined as the tendency toward relatively stable equilibrium between interdependent body systems as maintained by physiological processes. Now that is a mouthful of a definition. Let's break it down a little bit. Homeostasis is the tendency toward relatively stable equilibrium. This is probably the most important part of this definition. By relatively stable, we're referring to somewhere within a normal range, around what we call a set point. Now, this language might or might not be familiar to you. It turns out that when you look at different body systems, different organ systems within the human body, there are going to be variables that we can measure that will tell us how well that organ system is performing its job. For example, we can measure core body temperature. We can measure blood pressure. We can measure heart rate or respiratory rate as indicators of how well those systems are functioning. The variable that we measure does not have one single normal value. Instead, it has a normal range of values. During the day, we expect those variables to change under different conditions. That variable is considered normal if it falls within the normal range throughout the day. Now, the set point is sort of the average inside of that normal range. For example, core body temperature in human beings is often thought of as being 98.6 Fahrenheit. If you ask most people what normal body temperature is, they will tell you 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. In reality, that value is a set point. And in actuality, the normal range for body temperature is 97 to 99 degrees Fahrenheit. During different times of the day and under different conditions, our core body temperature goes up and down slightly. It's perfectly normal as long as it stays within the normal range. We expect body temperature and other variables to fluctuate during the day around that single value that we call the set point. The human body works very hard all day, every day, to maintain homeostasis, to maintain this relatively stable equilibrium. The question then is how? How does it do this? We describe the process by which the body maintains homeostasis using this model that we call the stimulus-response pathway. And I've got it outlined here on this slide. When we use the word stimulus here, what we're talking about is some kind of a change in one of those variables, one of those things that we can measure to see whether or not an organ system is functioning normally. Sometimes it's a physical change, sometimes it's a chemical change, but regardless, it can be measured, it can be quantified. So, for example, if we measure our core body temperature and we notice that it is starting to change, we would refer to that as a stimulus. The stimulus, the change in a variable, has to be detected in order for the body to respond to it. And the structure that does that detecting is referred to as a receptor. Now, receptors are located throughout the entire body, both on the surface of the body and throughout all of the internal structures. There are many different types of receptors. We're going to talk about those later in the course. But for now, understand that receptors are capable of detecting this change in some variable. The receptor then has to send that information, the information about the change, to what we refer to as a control center. The receptor sends that information electronically through the nervous system. It sends electrical impulses along sensory neurons toward this control center. The control center has the job of both interpreting this information and also responding to it, sending out some kind of instruction, again, electrically through the nervous system, to cause a change, to make some kind of a response, so that this variable doesn't leave its normal range. Now, the control center is essentially the brain and the spinal cord, again, part of the nervous system. And it's going to send out its response to what are referred to as effector cells and tissues. The control of homeostasis, the control center, involves both the nervous system and the endocrine system, the hormonal system in the body. We sometimes refer to this combination as the neuroendocrine system. The reason that it's important to have the neuroendocrine system in control of homeostasis is because the nervous system portion of it can respond very, very rapidly. The endocrine part of it responds less rapidly, but can provide a sustained response. The control center, the brain, the spinal cord, is going to interpret the incoming information and send out a response to some effector structure. That structure then will change in a way that brings a change to the variable and keeps the variable within the normal range. Now, the effectors that we see most often are things like muscle, both smooth muscle and skeletal muscle, and also various exocrine glands throughout the body, glands that secrete chemical compounds to make changes happen. The effector structure is going to bring some kind of change to the variable through its actions. In other words, it's the effector that is doing the work of the response. Now, let's look at an example of this stimulus response pathway as it applies to the way the body keeps core body temperature within its normal range. In other words, how the body maintains homeostasis with core body temperature. Remember, In human beings, the normal range for core body temperature is 97 to 99 degrees Fahrenheit. The set point is 98.6. The stimulus in the stimulus response pathway is some change in core body temperature, either up or down. Let's say that the person gets up in the morning and their core body temperature is something like 97.5 degrees Fahrenheit. Because of course, when we wake up first thing in the morning, our body temperature is a little bit lower than it is through most other times of the day. As the person gets out of bed and starts moving around and taking a shower and eating breakfast, core body temperature is going to start to rise. Again, there's nothing wrong with that as long as it stays inside the normal range. Homeostasis is relatively stable equilibrium. It's the mechanisms that keep variables within the normal range. The receptor for changes in temperature is called a thermoreceptor. You can find thermoreceptors in our skin. You can also find thermoreceptors throughout other parts of the body. These are structures that are sensitive to temperature. So when core body temperature shifts even a little bit, those receptors are going to detect that, and they're going to send that information along neural pathways to the control center. Now remember, we said the control center is generally brain and spinal cord. When it comes to temperature, though, there's a very particular region of the brain that this information will be sent to, and that's the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is going to receive this information about body temperature changing. It's going to interpret it, and it's going to send out some kind of a response. It's going to send that response along neural pathways to some kind of an effector structure in the body. Now, when it comes to temperature, there are several different effectors. Small blood vessels in the skin and throughout the body can function as effectors. Sweat glands in the skin can function as effectors, and even muscle. Remember, there's muscle in the skin that gives us what we often refer to as goosebumps. That's a muscle called an arrector pili muscle. We're going to talk about that muscle more when we talk about the skin. But even your larger skeletal muscles can help change your body temperature. The more you use a skeletal muscle, the warmer your body temperature gets. The effectors are going to make something happen. Blood vessels can dilate or constrict. Sweat glands can release sweat onto the surface of the skin. Muscle can contract or relax. It's through the actions of the effectors that we get the response. And the response is going to be some change in body temperature. In the case of body temperature, the change is going to be in the opposite direction to the stimulus. In other words, if temperature starts to go up, the response will be to take it back down. If temperature starts to go down, the response will be to bring it back up. So all day long, our body temperature changes up and down within its normal range. That's the way the body maintains homeostasis with regard to body temperature. Stimulus, receptor, control center, effector, response. The stimulus response pathway is the model that we use to understand how the body maintains homeostasis. Something we haven't talked about yet is that homeostasis requires feedback. And feedback can be either negative or positive. Now, all feedback is the method by which the response in the stimulus response pathway, the method by which the response happens. It can be either negative or positive. For example, when we talk about temperature control is an example of negative feedback. And by negative, we mean that the response will be in the opposite direction to the original stimulus. If body temperature started to go up, the response will start to bring it down. The things that the effectors are doing will help bring body temperature back down. That's negative feedback. The variable, remember, is fluctuating around a set point within a normal range. So the trick is to keep it within that normal range by constantly sending it in the opposite direction to how it's changing at any one moment. That is negative feedback. One other thing I've got on this slide I want you to take note of is that feedback often involves hormones. In the case of temperature control, there are no hormones involved, but there are other examples we'll talk about in a minute where hormones are involved in feedback. On this slide, you're looking at a diagram that helps us understand the concept of negative feedback. When the response in the stimulus response pathway takes the variable in the opposite direction to the original stimulus. On the x-axis, we can see time passing by, and on the y-axis, we can see a depiction of some normal range. Now, the normal range is defined by an upper value and a lower value and some set point somewhere in the middle, that average or ideal value within the normal range. When the variable hits the upper value, that's going to trigger a response. When it hits the lower value, that's going to trigger a response. So all day long, the variable is going up, 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 till it hits the upper value. The stimulus response pathway will be activated. Negative feedback will then send it in the opposite direction. Down, 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 till it hits the lower value. Negative feedback will then send it in the opposite direction. Up, 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 until it hits the upper value, and so on and so on. Now let's put the stimulus response pathway together with this negative feedback mechanism. Remember, the stimulus is the change in some variable. It's picked up by a receptor, which sends that information along neural pathways to the control center, the brain, the spinal cord. The control center is going to integrate the information and initiate some kind of a response. It sends the information about the response to some kind of effector, some kind of cell or tissue or structure that's going to initiate the response. And in cases of negative feedback, that response will be to take the variable in the opposite direction to the original stimulus. As that variable starts to go up as a stimulus, it'll be picked up by a receptor, sent to the control center, a response will be sent out, and the response will be to take it back down. As it goes down, down, and hits that lower level, that change will be picked up by the receptor, sent to the control center. The effector structures will then initiate the response to take it in the opposite direction, and so on and so on. On this slide, I've simply put into words what we just talked through with the diagram. The negative feedback that is involved in core body temperature homeostasis. Core body temperature begins to increase or decrease within the normal range. That's the stimulus. The stimulus is detected by receptors called thermoreceptors, and they relay that information along neural pathways to the brain. And when it comes to temperature, specifically the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is the control center for maintaining body temperature within homeostasis. The hypothalamus integrates the information and initiates the response, sends it out along neural pathways, back out to the body, to some kind of effector structures. Now, what exactly are the effectors for body temperature? Well, we mentioned sweat glands, blood vessels, and muscles, remember? The effectors are going to initiate the response. And in the case of body temperature, it's through negative feedback. To decrease temp within the normal range, we will increase the production of sweat onto the surface of the skin. That sweat will then evaporate and help lower body temperature back down. Small blood vessels can also dilate. That will cause temperature to go down. Now, the opposite can also happen. If body temperature starts to go down, negative feedback can bring it back up. In order to increase temperature within the normal range, small blood vessels can constrict and hold in body temperature. That'll help increase temp. Those arrector pili muscles I mentioned a minute ago, the ones that give us goosebumps, they can contract. That will help increase temperature. Skeletal muscles, larger skeletal muscles, can also contract. Those are the muscles that cause us to shiver, for example. That will help increase our body temperature. The key with body temperature is that we're using a negative feedback mechanism to maintain homeostasis. As body temperature goes up, negative feedback brings it back down using sweat glands and blood vessels. As body temperature starts to go down, negative feedback brings it back up using blood vessels, arrector pili muscles, skeletal muscles. Negative feedback brings the variable in the opposite direction to the original stimulus.